So far, let's just recap. So far, I told you where all 4 limb leads go. I told you about the salt, the pepper, ketchup, pickles, sometimes barbecue sauce, right? That's my way of doing it. If there's another way that works for you, that's okay too. I told you what each of the leads looks at, okay? For instance, the 6 limb leads. But then I gave you the 6 precordial leads. So now we've literally discovered or discussed all 12 leads of the 12 lead. But remember how we took 4 electrodes. Let's give you this again. We took 4 electrodes and it gave us these 6. And then we put 6 more electrodes and it gave us the next 6. So then we put 6 more electrodes and then it gave us the next 6 views. So when we add that together, we're going to have a total of 10 electrodes. So we're going to put 10 stickers on them, but that's going to give us 12 views, okay? And those 12 views make up what we know as the 12 lead. Now, we don't just have a 12 lead. For instance, there's a 15 lead, there's an 18 lead. So how would you do that? How would you do a 15 lead? Well, you would do the first 10 stickers that give you the 12 leads, but then after so you have V1, V2, V3, V4, V5, V6. Well, you continue around. For instance, let's just draw the back. So let's say this is the patient's, all right, so let's give me my pen. Let's say this is the patient's back, okay? All right, so we've got the scapula here. Okay, we've got the left and right scapula on the back. So right below that, right below the right inferior to the scapula, we would put the next 6 leads across the back, and those would actually be labeled V7, V8, V9, V10, V11, V12. Now, if you have all of those, that would actually make an 18 lead as opposed to a 15 lead. It just depends on how many wires you have, but this is where they go. Now, the reason we don't often see an 18 lead is because these electrodes are going on the patient's back. Well, they're often lying on their back, so that would just be uncomfortable. And depending on how they move, it can cause a lot of movement in the EKG. So we don't see this, but if you need to get a better view of what's going on, for instance, in the back of the heart, the posterior view of the heart, yes, you absolutely can do it. It just depends on what equipment you have. And it also depends on the patient's conditioning. So for instance, let's say you have an unconscious patient and they're lying on their back, they're on a backboard or something like that. It's going to be very difficult to get to their back. So that's why you don't see that often. Okay. Now, I want to go back to something. So let's go back to, let's go back to this V4. The reason I have it in a different color is, for instance, okay, most of this information on this 12 lead, let's go back to this. Most of the information on the 12 lead is giving us information about the left ventricle. What is it giving us information of? The left ventricle. Well, what if I want to figure out if the patient's having a right-sided heart attack as opposed to a left-sided heart attack? Well, for instance, let's say I see ST segment elevation. We're going to talk about STEMI. I'm going to go into great detail. I'll even explain exactly. I'm not just going to tell you what a STEMI is in terms of ST segment elevation or depression. I'm going to show you what a STEMI actually is in terms of the blood vessel, okay? Not just that you have a blockage in an artery, but I'm going to show you what's happening to produce, like, why does the line go up versus why does the line go down? I'm going to explain all of that. That's going to come up later during the week. So for now, let's talk about this. You do a 12 lead and you recognize that this patient is having a STEMI. And for instance, in lead V4, we have ST segment elevation. Well, then, for instance, what you could do is you could take V4, just take that one electrode, disconnect it from the patient, grab a new electrode, and then you would put it here. You're going to put it the same position, and so it's going to be fifth intercostal space, right midclavicular, okay? And now we would call it, instead of V4, we can't call it V4 because V4 means one spot. But we would now call that, for instance, V4 R for V4 right-sided. So what we're talking about is if you want to be able to figure out, is a person having for sure a right-sided MI, you could simply move V4, move it to the right side of the chest, run the 12 lead again, and then if you have elevation, okay, you could probably conclude that, okay, more than likely they're having a right-sided MI as well. The reason we do that is it's just a quick way to be able to get information without having to do an entire right-sided 12 lead, right? Because you have to you may not have enough wires. Now, if you have enough wires, like instead of having the 6 wires for V1 through V6, what if you have 2 sets of it? Then you could do a right-sided 12 lead as well. It just depends on how your machine is set up. Most of the time, you're not going to have that. So you simply would take V4, move it to the other side, run the 12 lead again. If you have ST elevation in V4R for V4 right-sided, you can probably conclude that they're having a right-sided MI as well. Okay. And now we're going to keep going. So the next thing we're going to talk about is how do you figure out the order of the 12 leads? Now, I want to first tell you a story, okay? This is actually a true story, believe it or not.